All right, Genesis 2, let's call this one At Last, and hopefully why will become clear shortly. But before that, this is a passage that gave me some trouble when I first started questioning whether or not I even believe in the Bible. And a lot of it has to do with famous story in chapter 2, and that has to do with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And ultimately, the question I came to was, okay, if the tree is a possible source of failure for the man, why put him around it in the first place? And if that wasn't bad enough, I kept reading and I started to question why God asked him to name the animals when naming the animals seemed to make him deeply aware of the fact that he was lacking. See, as the animals are going by in pairs and Adam's naming them, it seems that he comes into the realization that, wait a minute, each of these animals has somebody, but I don't. And that can be a tough realization. The Bible describes it like this in verse 20. The man gave names to all the livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. See, the animals could, on a certain level, provide companionship. I've heard dogs described as man's best friend, right? Another level is livestock. They can provide assistance, but ultimately they still weren't a proper fit. So why is it that in verse 18, God says, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. But then he drags him through the ordeal of being confronted of his lack. Why not just give him Eve at the moment God realizes it's not good for him to be alone? It seemed kind of cruel until I kept reading. And I saw Adam's reaction in verse 23. Then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And so when he finally sees Eve, his reaction is at last. And that really seemed to sum this story up for me. And it helped me understand how even though God originally seemed cruel by dragging him through the ordeal, what he, in a lot of ways, seemed to be doing was getting him ready for the reality of the relationship. Why? Because in a very few verses, they were both going to fall after eating from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam's first reaction was to blame Eve, and not just Eve, God for even giving him Eve. And so ultimately, something that he mentions in verse 24 helped to make all of this come together for me when it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. See, holding fast had everything to do with that emotional reaction Adam had to Eve when he said, at last. See, if God hadn't confronted him with the fact that he was lacking, it might have been easier for him to simply dismiss Eve in the midst of their conflict. But Adam remembered what it was like back when he was wanting. And so it was probably a lot easier for him to move past blame into forgiveness when he realized how much Eve meant to him. And so God dragging him into that job that confronted him with his need was really helping to prepare him to forgive, which is a practical component of love. And so then I started to realize before the Bible even starts to mention love, it seems like God is teaching Adam how to love in at least two ways. One, and even putting him around the tree in the first place, he was basically asking him a simple question. Adam, do you trust me? Do you trust me enough to, of your own free will, stay away from things I'm telling you aren't in your best interest? And then two, Adam, can you forgive her? And in a lot of ways, it seemed that Genesis chapter 2 was starting to teach about the foundational building blocks of what Jesus is later going to sum up as the summation of the law. Greatest command is love God and love people. If we can't trust God, I'm not sure we can actually love God. And if we can't forgive people, what's our love really worth? And so the question for us is this: if we're going to be able to truly appreciate our loved ones, whether it's a spouse, a friend, or a family member, we're going to probably have to go back to the appreciation of how at last God has brought us relief through those relationships. God's best to you as you go forward in him.